Hello, this is Zara Richter from the Facing Autonomy podcast. We are here with you for another episode with my co-host Sher Ali, and today we are interviewing Zoe Baker from an Anarcho Pack, specifically on her excellent article that you can find on the Anarchist Library entitled "Means and Ends: the Anarchist Critique of Seizing State Power." Um, Again, Zoe, feel free to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Zoe. I have recently submitted a PhD on the history of anarchist revolutionary strategy in Europe and the United States from 1868 to 1936. And I have a background in philosophy, and I've kind of accidentally become a historian of political theory.
Yeah.
And one of the main things I focus on in my PhD, there's a whole chapter on it, is the anarchist critique of state socialism, which often is kind of not really understood or accurately represented by critics of anarchism, and was something I spent a lot of time trying to kind of figure out by reading the primary sources.
Great.
Yeah. So, I'm really excited about this interview. Just sort of having this discussion, and I think, just just sort of how did you come about the sort of means and ends debate, and sort of, and what is your understanding of the state today? Would be, and why is this debate important to the longstanding divide between anarchists and communists, and that sort of thing, I guess.
So first, quick initial point, historically, the majority of anarchists were communists, and that there's a whole period in the 19th century where the main group of people who call themselves communists are actually anarchists, while Marxists tend to call themselves social democrats or just socialists, even though they do sometimes use the word communist, especially when referring back to Marx and Engels. So I don't want to create the kind of the notion that there's this opposition between anarchism and communism. There's a kind of a distinction between certain kinds of Marxists and kind of anarchism, all of whom in this debate are basically communists. As for means and ends, so when you read historic anarchist literature, one of the things I kept noticing over and over again was that they keep using the phrase means and ends and talking about the need for a unity between them. And I then spent ages trying to figure out what it was. And then I came across what I think is the best kind of paragraph summary of it that's been written, which is by an Italian anarchist called Enrico Malatesta. And in his anarchist program, which was first written in 1898, and then was adopted by the Italian Anarchist Union, which is a large specific anarchist organization, in 1920. And the paragraph goes as follows, and I think it really nicely summarizes the idea. So Malatesta says, quote, "It is not enough to desire something. If one really wants it, adequate means must be used to secure it. And these means are not arbitrary, but instead cannot be conditioned by the ends we aspire to and by the circumstances in which the struggle takes place. For if we ignore the choice of means, we would achieve other ends, possibly diametrically opposed to those we aspire to, and this would be the obvious and inevitable consequence of our choice of means. Whoever sets out on the high road and takes a wrong turning does not go where he intends to go, but where the road leads him." And so what this means is, because with anarchist theory, they'll often say things in very plain language. They can superficially seem to be kind of quite basic, but actually have a lot of theoretical stuff going on underneath it when you've kind of read everything else they've written and then used that to understand it. So what's being said in this paragraph is that when people engage in kinds of activity, they simultaneously transform themselves and the world. And this is something which Marx agrees with. He talks about this in his thesis on Feuerbach, where he defines revolutionary praxis as the coincidence of the changing of circumstances and the changing of individuals. So, for example, workers organize, they go on strike and win the strike. And through doing that, they not only change social relations and the kind of social world, like, yay, they're now earning more money, or the trade union is larger than it was before, they've also changed themselves in certain respects. So they've acquired new ideas, like trade unions are good. They've developed new abilities, like they know how to organize a trade union. And they've developed new drives, like they want to stand up to their boss. They want to organize against the capitalist class. Now, given this way of thinking about human activity and how people change themselves through it, it follows that if you have a particular end goal, such as a free, equal, classless society, so communism, if you have that goal, then you have to engage in particular kinds of activity to reach it, which simultaneously transform people and society in such a manner that you do, in fact, reach the goal. So, given this, if you try to achieve a free and equal society through authoritarian means, you won't, in fact, reach it, because the process of engaging in authoritarian actions and creating organizations structured in an authoritarian way will produce people and social relations that will just reproduce authoritarianism. So, for example, people will learn to for example, let's say you're a police officer, you engage in the activity of being a police officer. That will transform you into someone who's okay with hitting people and exerting arbitrary power over others and coming up with reasons for why it was necessary and good. And that won't happen if you're engaging in a totally different kind of activity. So therefore, it's not a good idea to, say, use that kind of activity to reach a free society. And the converse is also true, right? So if you want to reach a free society, you have to engage in acts in the moment that transform you into someone who's capable of living in such a society. So, for example, and this is why anarchists argue that you have to make decisions in a non-hierarchical way through kind of direct democracy, because if you have a situation where, say, we elect representatives and they tell everyone else what to do, then people aren't engaging in the kinds of activity that will transform them into people who can actually achieve a free society, because it will just, the authoritarian social relations just become self-reproducing. And anarchists applied this to the state, right? So they defined the state as a centralized and hierarchical institution in which you have a minority who they call a political ruling class, make decisions and impose them on others through violence. And this is different to how a lot of Marxists talk about the state, where it's usually like, if an institution performs the function of reproducing the power of a particular class, then it's a state. So then it makes sense to say, well, a workers' state is just a group of workers with guns who are imposing their will on capitalists. That isn't actually a state by the anarchist definition, and they also advocate workers with guns imposing their will on capitalists. In order for it to be a state, it has to not only reproduce a certain kind of class rule, but also be hierarchical and centralized and have a kind of ruling minority. And what anarchists argued was that given the need for the unity of means and ends, given the need for us to engage in kinds of activity which transform us into the kinds of people who can create a free society and create the social relations of a free society, it follows that if you try to seize state power to achieve communism, you won't actually advance towards that goal, because instead what will happen is, given what a state is, you'll have a small minority at the top who develop new distinct class interests as exercises of state power, and then are separated from the workers who they initially came from or who they think of themselves as being representatives of. They will create a new top-down form of power that they then exercise over workers, and then develop an interest in expanding and reproducing. And then that will just continuously reproduce itself unless it's violently overthrown. So this is why anarchists don't think, a state will wither away. They think that the state always has to be violently overthrown, because given their theory of social structures, it will just be self-reproducing. And if you want to create a kind of free society, you therefore have to not seize state power and instead figure out a way of transitioning beyond capitalism, which doesn't result in a small minority who, even if they have really good intentions, end up monopolizing decision-making power in a social structure and becoming a distinct political ruling class. So I hope that was clear and answered the question.
That was great.
That was excellent. Yeah, thank you. I'll go next. So I love so many things about what you said there, Zoe. I love what you're saying about theory and praxis being united. I love this notion that what we're doing in the now, it's something that generates what can be done in the future. I think that that's a really important moment to remember for those that are really hyped about, thinking that some vote in some election will do something, as they are in my country currently. I think what you're saying about the state is really brilliant. Um, uh, while I think the only place where I might push is that I think you do get some kind of utopian anarchists that think, oh, by just building a commune on the edge of society, that alone will make the state wither away. Who take some of this, the 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 world of the new and the shell of the old, such an extent that they abandon the issue of class struggle and the issue of fighting bourgeois institutions. And so I think the only place where some of us here at this podcast, who we are influenced a little bit by Marxism, would push back is that it can't just be the prefigural politics, but it also has to be a politics which does clash with the institutions of the bourgeoisie, on a fundamental level. And we don't want to become like, if you know about Georgism or several of these kind of pseudo anarchist movements that kind of would start a commune somewhere, and it would just kind of liberalize slowly outside of the norm. So anyway, that's all leading to a question.
Can I quickly reply to that, because that's a
yeah, please reply. Please reply to that.
So Kropotkin, Reclus, and Malatesta all explicitly reject the strategy of we just build small counter institutions like co-ops or communities, like in America, like the utopian socialists did in the mid-19th century. They were kind of reacting against that and going, this won't work. And it was for the same reason that you just gave, which is that we have to engage in class struggle. We have to, anarchists were committed to direct action against the political and economic ruling classes. They were in favor of forcefully expropriating the capitalist class. And so the role of the prefiguration is you're creating the institutions which are engaging in that class struggle and which are then in a position during the revolution to transition from being instruments of class struggle to be ones which self-manage the emerging future society. And that's what in the building the new world in the shell of the old, which, as I'm sure you're aware, comes from the IWW preamble. For them, the new world in the shell of the old were militant trade unions, which were going to forcefully expropriate the ruling classes during an insurrection and a general strike. And so anarchists very much agree with that critique of kind of what you might want to call naive prefigurative politics, where it's just all prefigurative, but no kind of those prefigurative organizations being instruments of class struggle as well. And for anarchists, those two things were very linked, because in order to be an effective instrument of working class self-emancipation, you have to structure organizations in a manner such that they enable workers to learn how to self-manage their lives. So they think, if we're going to have a revolution, workers need to know how to make decisions effectively prior to the revolution, because if they're just doing it all during the revolution, it can cause lots of problems to do with, say, food or like water, and you can have massive disasters just due to people not really knowing how to kind of organize these things in a revolutionary way. And therefore anarchists thought it was really important that as many workers as possible have had an experience of self-managing and were prepared for their role as people who organized a society, rather than just doing what capitalists told them to. So yeah, hope that clarifies things.
And this is a great segue into this overall question that Sher began to pose prior to this conversation beginning, which is the question of organization. Sher, would you like to ask a question about organization since we started on the discussion of it?
Yeah, but before that, I think I just, I haven't had a chance to read Malatesta or these authors as closely. And, just like, for people like in Pakistan who may listen to this or other places, can you like explain a little bit about Malatesta and how you came to learn about Malatesta or Kropotkin? I mean, Kropotkin's a well-known name, but I think like Malatesta says some really cool things, just, not just about like, the question of violence, but just in terms of organization, uh, sort of in that sort of theoretical sort of framework. I think like it's just something that I've been, I was hoping you could just sort of expand upon.
So explain who Malatesta is and talk
Yeah,
about what he
just
thinks
like
about
the
organization.
overall legacy of Malatesta or the afterlife of Malatesta, how people look at Malatesta, or
So,
you know,
okay.
or how Malatesta influences you, or something like that.
Yeah. So Malatesta was an Italian anarchist who's very interesting as a historic figure because he becomes an anarchist when he's 18. In the First International, he's radicalized by the Paris Commune, which happens in, as far as I remember, 1871. He quickly becomes one of the dominant figures in the Italian section of the First International, which becomes the Sintim International, although at the time they just call it the International because they think it's the same organization. And this is a majority anarchist organization. And he is then with the movement from then to when he dies in the early 1930s under fascist Italy in house arrest under Mussolini, who interestingly Malatesta knew Mussolini's dad and kind of knew Mussolini as a child, as far as I recall, and wasn't obviously expecting to die under house arrest with this person, former socialist, as a fascist dictator. And Malatesta is kind of not super well known in the way that, say, if people know famous anarchists, it's usually like, Proudhon, Bakunin, Kropotkin. And historically, Malatesta was actually one of the most widely read and most translated anarchists internationally, and wrote a lot of what were the standard introductions to anarchism that were distributed, within the workers' movement. And he edited multiple newspapers. He participated in several insurrections. He traveled all over the world. So kind of one of the reasons why Interpol exists is Malatesta, which is that what would happen, this is the case for loads of different anarchists historically, but they're organizing in one place, state repression happens, they have to go to another place where they then also organize and repeat. So Malatesta goes from, Italy to South America. He tries to participate in fighting the British Empire when they invade Egypt and then gets arrested. He escapes from an island where he's imprisoned. He ends up in exile in London, where he then kind of sneaks back into Italy and publishes things in a newspaper illegally while claiming that he's still in London, even though he's now undercover. So he had a very exciting life, but is also an unbelievably clear and interesting theorist that I think kind of everyone who's a revolutionary should read today. And the reason why is that almost everything Malatesta wrote that's been translated into English, his complete works is about 10 volumes, as far as I recall. But so far, only 2 volumes have been published. And there's also an anthology called The Method of Freedom that covers selections from what will be the full complete works. But almost everything he wrote was about strategy. And as a result, it continues to be of extreme relevance to ongoing struggles because we can read this extremely experienced, not only theorist, but also organizer, militant who risked his life for human emancipation on multiple occasions, was imprisoned for huge amounts of his life, was banned from several different countries. And we can read him and I think learn a lot. And one of the big things that he talks about again and again is the thing I just talked about, the unity of means and ends. And one of the kind of points Malatesta reiterates again and again, which I think is very interesting, which is that it's not about intentions. It's not about, I have good intentions and I do the good things. Instead, you have to think about the kind of activity you're engaging in and how that will transform people. And so, people might say, oh yeah, we're going to do electoral politics, we're going to build towards socialism through that, I've got really good intentions, I'm going to become a member of parliament and change the world for the better. And Malatesta's point is that, well, you may have all these amazing intentions, but social structures are just much bigger than you. You'll participate in those social structures, like the existing bourgeois state, and you won't transform it, it will transform you. And Malatesta applies this to everything, basically. So he talks about how, people might want to use trade unions as a way to overthrow capitalism, but trade unions also have a tendency, irrespective of people's intentions, to end up becoming reformist and not revolutionary, even if they're initially founded by revolutionaries, because he thinks their role as institutions is to, say, increase wages, to negotiate with bosses, to have to deal with governments. And the consequence of that is that over time, in order to try and genuinely improve the lives of people, there's a tendency for them to become, say, bureaucratic or no longer concerned with emancipation and more concerned with improving things within capitalism. And so he thinks, well, we have to organize as anarchists to try and prevent this from happening to trade unions. And he likewise talks a lot about how anarchist groups should be structured and make decisions. Again, because it's not about intentions. You might be like, yeah, I'm a really great anarchist, but then create an organization that, irrespective of what you intend, will transform people and produce social relations that won't actually achieve your goal. And I think that's one of the big insights that I always get whenever I read Malatesta is it's really important to think about what actions you're engaging in, what social structures you're relating to or participating in, and how those affect people, and how that will happen irrespective of what you believe and think and want to be the case. And so you have to be, very realistic. And yes, read Malatesta. He's very, very good.
And this is very relevant to what our podcast has been trying to do. Our podcast was initially forged from our own, engagement with Marxist humanist Johnson Forrest tendency, which came out of the United States in the 1970s, and the autonomous Marxist tendency, which kind of emerged in Italy in the 1970s. And both of these movements, were trying to take on the already stagnant left, at the time in both the United States and Europe, which had become lost in these institutions, which were no longer serving an insurgent purpose in the least bit, and so I think the struggle is still for people in this current moment where political parties and trade unions have both been already sort of rotten from the inside due to their tendency to become instruments of capital in the state, and this problem that a lot of current organizers are dealing with, which is how to take these old tools and make them new and powerful again, instead of just replicating the same old problems time after time. And that's something. Do you have any advice on how to make trade unions less co-opted, on how to make communes less co-opted, on how to make political parties less controlled by a middle class idealistic or electoralist fringe?
So the first thing I would say is that I think it's very important that kind of institutions of struggle remain independent of and against the state. And the reason for that is that even if in the short term, say, working within the state or devoting loads of resources towards elections can result in certain really important short-term gains, in the long term, it makes that what was initially an instrument of struggle be transformed and embedded within the institutions which reproduce class rule. And so if you're thinking about long-term revolutionary strategy rather than just short-term improvements, which are, of course, important, but if you genuinely want to reach the goal which we share of human emancipation through the self-emancipation of the working class, then I think it's really important to remain outside and against the state. If people want to vote in elections, that's okay, but that's distinct from actively campaigning for a political party which is involved in those elections, or kind of creating, say, an alliance at an organizational level between a trade union and a political party, which is the case, for example, like the Labour Party is united with certain English trade unions and has been for a very long time. So that point. And then the second thing I would say is that I don't feel like there's a kind of magic bullet where, like, if we just do these things, things will work out and we achieve communism, yay. But I can say what certain historic people thought about this question. And the things that they really focused on was how the trade union is structured. So anarchist trade unionists spent a huge amount of time debating internally about how the trade union should be organized to prevent a bureaucracy from developing. So the Spanish anarchist trade union, the CNT, which is founded in 1910 and by 1936 has 750,000 members. They, in their organization, they only had, as far as I recall, 2 full-time paid bureaucrats. Everyone else was a volunteer doing it in their spare time alongside their other sources of earning a living. And the reason why they did this is because they really didn't want there to develop a kind of bureaucracy in the trade union who then developed distinct interests from the membership. Another feature of the organization was that so it's a federal structure where you have at the bottom what was called the single union. Then the single unions federate together on a local basis, and the single union will bring together people in all people in a particular industry. So you might have like all the construction workers in one place, and all the dock workers in another, and they will then federate on a regional basis. So you have all the single unions from all the different industries in, say, in one bit of Barcelona, and then for Barcelona as a whole, and then for Spain. And so you build up at each level. And they made it so that as many decisions as possible were made by assemblies. So you have the assembly of the local union, which is where the people, every member of the local union is there and making decisions, and they elect delegates who are mandated on what decisions they make by the people who elect them. So again, they don't develop these like distinct interests. And one of the main ways the CNT kind of coordinated between different single unions was you'd have assemblies of delegates representing each single union. So you have, say, a small general assembly of, say, 12 delegates, and they will be making decisions based on what they've been told by all their single unions, rather than we elect a representative and they then make the decisions and we do what they say. And it's in order to ensure that as many decisions as possible are made by the workers at the local level, and you don't get this kind of bureaucratic caste arising. And I think there are lots of lessons from how kind of anarchist and syndicalist trade unions organized that, people should kind of study and try to implement, because they were effective at preventing certain kinds of authoritarian social relations from occurring. They weren't perfect, but nothing is. But I think it's they spent my point I'm trying to make is people in the past had similar problems, and we can see how they tried to overcome those problems and maybe learn kind of lessons and organizational techniques that they found effective. We're also, of course, trying to update them and improve upon them. And the third point is that there were disagreements about how to basically make sure a trade union remained revolutionary. And there are kind of, I guess, 2 main positions that I will talk about. So the first one, which is that we make the trade union have an explicitly anarchist constitution or declaration of principles, right? So the trade union is committed to libertarian communism, it's committed to, the general strike, it's committed to revolution. And they thought this was a way of trying to preserve the revolutionary nature of the trade union. But one of the problems, and this is pointed out by Malatesta, of doing that is that obviously loads of people join the trade union just because they want to earn more, not because they're actually hardcore communists. And then what can happen is, although on paper the organization, say, is committed to libertarian communism, in practice, most of the membership aren't actually communists, and it's kind of a facade. The actual organization isn't actually really revolutionary, even though on paper it should be. Or the alternative is it can result in essentially a really small group of hardcore anarchist militants who call themselves a trade union, but they're not actually doing what trade unions do because they're not able to mobilize and be a large-scale instrument of class struggle. And they're really just a small group of anarchists who sometimes organize within their workplace. And so there's some dangers there. And Malatesta's kind of view was that you should have a specific anarchist organization, which is an organization where everyone in it is an anarchist. And that specific anarchist organization should participate in a trade union, which is basically open to all workers, in order to try and spread anarchist ideas within it and be a kind of, what historically was often called the militant minority, who are trying to spread, and educate people about direct action and encouraging people to do it and explaining anarchist ideas. And that this is a way of spreading those ideas among the rank and file in a coordinated manner, rather than just kind of doing it in a, doing it as you go, rather than actually seriously organizing it and doing it in a dedicated way. And this is what the Italian Anarchist Union historically did in Italy, and played a key role in the factory occupation movement in the kind of early 1920s. And we're really trying to push it towards a full-blown insurrection. Like Malatesta would give speeches, encouraging people to get guns and prepare to expropriate. And then to simplify the history, but then the movement ended up falling apart because state socialists went for a compromise and a reform rather than pushing for revolution, and then the movement got repressed. But you can try again with the militant minority tactic.
Yeah, I feel like the thing about Malatesta, which I think was ahead of his time, was, not looking at power as sort of nested or like in some centralized manner, like seeing power like within society in the form of the state, in the form of, the power relations, the multiplicity of power, right? Also like calling out the role of like, say, patriotism or sort of the nationalism, and the way that sort of has been utilized to co-opt, the proletariat or the working classes or oppressed people, like the narrative of anarchists, I guess you could say, at a certain level. And I think like, what is interesting today is precisely this sort of tension between spontaneity and sort of like organization, right? In which like organizations tend to become these like monolithic sort of formulas to everything, but they're also a necessary evil, right? And how do you sort of create that sort of create a party which create an organization which is sort of rooted in communities and those things. And I think like, in the US there've been I think like anarchists have been at the forefront fighting fascists and especially in the various forms of struggle, like especially after the George Floyd rebellion in Minnesota, and then what's happening in Portland or even in Philadelphia and other places. Like I think this question of organization is still very much present amongst like organizers and things like that, but it's also a confusing question at the same time, because you're always in this battle also with other forms of power which are functioning within society, not just some monolithic state that you have to sort of take over.
Well, and this was obviously a big question historically as well, and a kind of quick random fact, but it's so anarchists often use the term spontaneity, and it has to be kept in mind that most of them are writing in French, and in French, it's a mistranslation of the time because it indicates to an English reader something which isn't in the original, which is that they essentially mean like voluntary, self-determining. People are choosing to do this themselves on their own, kind of based on their own desires and inclinations, as opposed to someone else is being like, you do these things. As opposed to it happens without planning or coordination, or just kind of comes out of nowhere, which is what it can often suggest in English. So like Bakunin, say, will talk about the need for a spontaneous revolution, but in other passages will say that the workers have to form this kind of mass organization in order to stand up to the organized force of the ruling class. And people can go, well, isn't this contradictory? It's not, it's a translation error. He's saying when he talks about spontaneity or spontaneous revolution, he means workers, essentially, the self-emancipation of the working class. And later debates, particularly in kind of Second International Marxism, are then read back into these historic anarchist texts, which use it in a kind of different way, and people often aren't aware of that. The way that anarchists historically talk about the debate is that you essentially have a division between, so there's various terms they use actually historically. So sometimes they literally call themselves the vanguard, and anarchists routinely historically refer to themselves as the vanguard of the working class. And when you compare what they were doing to the Social Democrats at the time, I can kind of see what they thought of themselves in that way. Or they refer to themselves as the militant minority. In Spain, the colloquial term was anarchist militants in the CNT were referred to by other workers as the ones with ideas, the ones with consciousness. Malatesta often uses the terms kind of conscious individuals. Essentially people who've, got hardcore dedicated to political principles, they have a strategy, they're organized as a political project. And they then compare that to essentially, other workers doing their own thing. And then they talk a lot about what should the relationship be between the conscious anarchists and workers in general. And this is a huge topic of discussion, but the basic thing that they end up saying is that the sole role of the anarchist minority is to spread anarchist ideas and to inspire other people to emancipate themselves. So you can, give talks, you can tell people what to read, like, hey, this is a good book, you should check it out. You can, produce newspapers and counterculture as a way to spread your ideas among the kind of wider working class and wider social movements. And you can engage in actions as anarchists, which other people see and then copy. Or you try to say, when you create a group, anarchists still do this, make sure it's organized in a certain way so that even when people come into the group, they're not anarchists, but they're quickly acting like anarchists anyway, right? Like they're learning how to non-hierarchically associate, they're learning good decision-making procedures, and through that, they're also, again, transforming themselves. And so, but what they shouldn't do is try to essentially, take over social movements, just use social movements as like a means to an end. You get certain kind of Marxist sects, not all, obviously, but, some who essentially see social movements as a way to recruit people to the party, to buy the newspaper, to attend talks, just to kind of perpetuate the existence of the party itself, rather than actually build towards emancipation. It becomes a kind of end in itself. It's often really about certain people in a central committee continuing to have fresh recruits. And anarchists kind of were very much against that approach, where you're instead merely participating as equals within struggle, but you're doing it with an agenda, right? You're doing it because you're committed to human emancipation, because you want to achieve communism. And therefore, the focus is talking to people, treating them as equals, persuading them, and showing them, look, we can act effectively in these ways. And the hope is that other people will copy that. And through that, the kind of what anarchists historically called the spirit of revolt would spread. And often, historically, this was based on what's now called organizational dualism. But the idea is you have a mass public organization, which were mostly trade unions historically, and then an organization of dedicated anarchist militants, which were historically referred to as specifically anarchist organizations or anarchist federations. These two things, this is what Bakunin advocated as well. And the idea is that they have kind of different functions in struggle, but are both necessary. Because if anarchists by themselves can't abolish capitalism, there'll never be prior to the abolition of capitalism, the majority of the population, say, anarchists didn't think would be anarchists. They would become anarchists during the revolution itself. therefore you shouldn't expect to kind of just, we have more and more anarchists, then we overthrow capitalism. Instead, we have to have mass organizations which draw all kinds of different workers together in order to act politically. And therefore, that's not going to be the same as the anarchist-only groups, who are kind of a militant minority within those social movements. The current term for it in kind of Latin American anarchism is called especificismo. They are committed to what they call social insertion, because while historically it was the case that you often had mass organizations like trade unions the militant minority could participate in, now it's often more, there's a massive protest happening, there's an informal series of assemblies occurring, as opposed to a formal organization that people are involved in. So therefore, it's more about being involved in struggles and ongoing social movements, which was the case historically, but it was more the case that there was lots of huge trade unions for them to be working with, which isn't necessarily as much the case anymore.
Why do you think that's the case?
Well, because of, global counter-revolution, right? Like, what happened to all the really radical trade unions? Well, they got smashed apart, right? Like they got killed, they got imprisoned, they got deported. At the kind of the height of anarcho-syndicalism in the early 20th century, there were, several million members of these trade unions around the world. That's no longer the case. And there's a reason why, which is that they were literally brutally smashed. So, the anarcho-syndicalist trade union in Germany, the FAUD, which Rudolf Rocker was a member of, was, violently suppressed by the Nazis. Lots of anarchists were, died in concentration camps who had to flee the country. In France, they have to kind of go underground because of World War II. In Latin America, loads of anarchist trade unions like the Fora, again, get smashed through state repression. So it's kind of, we lost, essentially. There was a global counter-revolution, and the trade unions which survive are obviously not, revolutionary ones. And part of the reproduction of capitalism itself, the kind of the left wing of capital, as I believe some people call them. And of course, in other places, it's because the big popular social movement becomes, say, Maoism or Marxism-Leninism, and then obviously you have breaks from that, like autonomism in Italy. But it's a simultaneous thing of massive repression of the international anarchist movement with massive rise in kind of different kinds of Marxism, becoming one of the main vehicle of global opposition to capitalism. While in the 19th century, it was the anarchist movement that was one of the main global oppositions to capitalism in a way that Marxism at the time wasn't. And it's only kind of relatively recently that there's been a big resurgence of anarchism. So there's a whole period in the 20th century where you have lots of really old anarchist militants who are, meeting up and hanging out, but one by one, they die, and the movement declines and their memories decline. Although there are, of course, a huge amount of heroic struggle that happens, like the CNT, for example, continue to exist after the Spanish Civil War in exile. There's lots of very complex struggle going on. So I don't want to give the false impression that it's like anarchism wasn't a thing. It was a thing. It just wasn't as unbelievably huge as it was at the beginning of the 20th century before all the repression happened. But yeah.
Thank you for this. Your commentary is amazingly erudite, despite studying something which wouldn't be given time in an academic classroom in the United States for the most part. You sound so rigorous in your understanding of these histories, and so it's really breathtaking to hear an anarchist like yourself who's very good at theory. Your understanding of theory and history is really strong. So thank you so much. What do you have to say about the reemergence of the IWW in the current era? I know in the U.S. it seems like the Wobblies have kind of reemerged since the 1990s, but it seems like they're very different than they were in the 20s. Do you feel that there are similarities in this new emergence of anarchism that we're seeing today, or do you think that it's just anarchist aesthetics with a mainly liberal institutional function?
So I'm not super familiar with the ins and outs of the contemporary IWW. And I'm aware that with contemporary social movements, like all social movements, there's going to be a lot of interpersonal disputes and what you might call drama, but and kind of things that people in activist scenes know about that I'm entirely ignorant of. So my, knowledge of the IWW as an outsider who every now and then reads something about it, and there are, of course, ways in which it is different to what it was historically, but I think that's due to the kind of changing nature of struggle. There are things that the IWW were able to do historically that aren't really currently viable given the state of like the left. There's a level of kind of militancy and ability to engage in large-scale direct action that is a lot harder now than it was then. And to give an example of the kind of thing I mean, this isn't like an IWW story, but it's an example of what was quite not necessarily common, but it's something that often happened historically in this period in trade unions, which you just wouldn't expect to see now in the kind of so-called Western world, which is that in the United States, there's a massive strike of dye workers, and an anarchist called Luigi Gallini participates in this, and it escalates when they try to kind of shut down production to kick the scabs out into a full-blown gunfight with the police, in which Gallini's shot in the face and he's okay, but there's a really extensive gun battle with the police during a strike. And this is quite a kind of common thing in labor history at this time, including in the United States, which is a very violent labor history. Well, now it's like we stand outside a shop picketing it, like the nature of struggle people engaging in is very different due to the different historical circumstances. And it's not like I'm going to kind of bash contemporary people in the IWW for not launching like an armed strike against the police, because the ability of the state to repress people is much greater now than it was then. So Gallini, after this gun exchange with the police, is able to go into hiding and avoid police detection in a way that I don't think would really be possible now, but was possible given the level of surveillance and technology at the time. And so I very much support, what the current IWW is doing in terms of trying to regrow, revolutionary syndicalism as a movement. And there's various other kind of radical unions, not just the IWW doing that I'm very inspired by and kind of wish the best for, such as in there's a recent emergence in Bangladesh of some anarcho-syndicalists who they were Marxist-Leninists, and then they kind of began reading about anarchism and evaluating the history of the 20th century and ended up becoming anarcho-syndicalists. And now they're doing an amazing job organizing extremely poor and exploited tea workers. And it's things like that that give me hope, even if it's on a small scale, even if it's not a huge mass strike. It's the kind of, it has to be remembered that historic trade unions began small as well, and since the historic militant wing of trade unionism was violently destroyed, we have to kind of begin again. And that's going to be a long and patient work. It's going to be slow. It's going to be, a lot of it's going to be not exciting, not things that you'll kind of read in a history book and be like, wow, that's really cool, like a kind of armed insurrection, because most struggle is not like that, right? But without that kind of everyday struggle, the exciting stuff would never happen.
Great, that was amazing. Do you have any questions, Sher, or should we move to discussing the politics of identity and how they relate to all of this?
Yeah, for sure. I think that would be great. I think this has been, I'm learning a lot, and this has been, awesome.
Okay, so we're gonna switch gears a little bit. I think we've really received a lot of education from your immense historical erudition on these matters, which is just not something that we meet from most anarchists in the United States. So we really appreciate your scholarly knowledge and the breadth and width of it. But how do you see identity politics and its history playing into this kind of story of the 20th century that you told about all of this anarchist resurgence in the early 20th century, and then some Marxists taking over. Where do you see the emergence of, say, various types of feminism, various types of anti-racism, various types of queer struggles in the mid 20th century, and how do they play with these dynamics that you've already described for us, Zoe?
So historically, the socialist movement wasn't as good as we as modern people would like on issues of race, gender, sexuality. The anarchist Emma Goldman, for example, would give talks on homosexuality, which were really, really positive, but other anarchists would respond saying that, you shouldn't discuss, quote, perverted sex forms. It will damage the reputation of the movement. A number of historic anarchists were very sexist. Bakunin was an anti-Semite. But at the same time, there were also some really amazing things that occurred historically, organizing along lines of what we would now call identity. So, for example, in Germany, Millie Rocker, Rudolf Rocker's wife, organized a kind of women's wing of the anarcho-syndicalist trade union, which organized housewives and women in general in parallel to the kind of main trade union. So the idea was for every section of the trade union, there will be a parallel group of all the women as a women-only space. And this is in, Weimar, Germany. And anarchist men responded by being sexist, but, the women didn't care and kept doing it. But of course, despite, these kind of inspiring examples historically, there were serious problems with sexism and homophobia and racism in the movement. And this isn't just anarchism, it's also the case with Marxism. And one of the things that really emerges in the New Left from the 60s onwards is the idea of feminism being much more crucial to these projects and changing how we interpersonally relate with each other being really important. So, for example, historic anarchists, men would often be like, yes, I'm in favor of women's emancipation, but then obviously still expect their wife to do all the housework. While, not viewing that as logically kind of inconsistent. Little tidbit, there was an Argentinian historic anarchist group who kind of were women who would write critiques of male sexism in the movement, and they adopted the slogan, no gods, no masters, no husbands. And this is in the 19th century, and I think it's an excellent slogan.
Beautiful.
But to return to the New Left, and this kind of focus on interpersonal stuff, and changing how you relate to people on a day-to-day level, I think is a really important complement to historic anarchists who tended to focus much more on how as a group do we make decisions or structure organizations in terms of prefiguration. I think another core aspect of prefiguration should be, how you relate and interpersonally interact with people in private and in public to make sure you're not reproducing power relations and oppressive social structures. And one of, I think, the big insights that develops the New Left is identity politics. So not many people are aware of this, but the one of the earliest, if not the earliest, usages of the term identity politics were by Black Marxists, women, a lot of whom were lesbians. They write a text, they're the Combahee River Collective, and they write a statement in which they talk about how systems of oppression interlock. And so you can't just think of, we have capitalism and sexism and racism as distinct things. Instead, they form an interconnected social structure in which the oppression people experience isn't like, I have my capitalism oppression and then I have my sexist oppression. It's like, no, you experience the interlocking of those two structures, right? So you won't just have a boss who oppresses you, you'll have a male boss who sexually harasses you at work. And that's that intersection of, say, sexism and capitalism that's occurring. And given this nature of the interlocking systems of oppression, they think a very important way to organize is thinking about their identity as Black women, as being a thing to organize around, rather than say we only organize around class. They're saying, well, there are other axes of oppression that we can also organize around. And it's often the case that people kind of try to create this false opposition, like you've got to pick class politics or identity politics. Well, you don't. And these, committed Marxists, socialists who advocate the abolition of capitalism in this statement very much were in favor of doing both. And I think that's what we as modern socialists have to do. We have to organize along lines of, race, gender, sexuality, and class, and do those things together. Is why I think it's important, say, to have in a socialist party or in an anarchist trade union to have, say, women-only groups, or people of color-only groups, so they can get together, talk about their experiences, organize, educate themselves, radicalize themselves, but also make sure to do that in a way where they are able to spread that knowledge and that kind of views among the wider organization. So you don't get a situation where, say, the women have their women's only group and they're doing really amazing things in it, but the men are kind of oblivious of it, because obviously we want to transform the men and make them kind of no longer engage in sexist behavior. And to do that, you have to have a kind of strong kind of interconnection between the identity-only groups and the kind of class group that unites everyone irrespective of their identity. And sometimes it's argued that, well, we shouldn't do identity politics because it kind of results in essentialism, right? Like, we have these categories, say, like being gay or being black or being women, and then we reify them and naturalize them and come to view them as essential constitutive aspects of ourselves and the world, rather than being historically specific configurations of different elements that we've been socialized into and reproduce consciously and unconsciously during our lives, right? Where we no longer think that we can get to a point where people no longer think in terms of race because we've abolished racism. Or some people say, we should want to abolish gender, and therefore we shouldn't reify these categories. And the point I would make is that historically, socialist groups spent a huge amount of time instilling in people the identity of being a worker, and what that meant, and what the kind of interest they had in virtue of being workers, right? So rather than, say, you primarily thinking of yourself based on, say, your religion or other aspects of yourself, you should primarily view yourself as a producer who has certain class interests against the capitalist class. But in doing that, they weren't rarefying the notion of being a worker because they were in favor of the abolition of capitalism, such that when capitalism is abolished, the worker as the proletariat, as people who have nothing to sell but their labor power, who sell their labor to capitalists in exchange for a wage, that category is abolished during the struggle for emancipation. But during that struggle, it's important that workers develop a sense of themselves as an oppressed class in order to emancipate themselves. And I would likewise argue that it's important, say, for women or people of color or queers to develop notions of themselves as these categories, but in a way that drives towards the abolition of the oppressive social structures which reproduce these categories, which isn't to say that I want to say a situation where no one anymore thinks of themselves as trans. I don't really know what the future of gender will be. But I can say that, say, the current notions of gender, we don't have to worry about essentializing that if we organize along lines of, say, being a woman. In the same way, we don't think you have to worry about that when we organize along the lines of being a worker, because the crucial point is what our goal is, what kinds of activity we're engaging in. So if we're struggling against racism and doing it in a kind of very informed way, that's very different to, say, a really kind of vulgar liberal identity politics where the focus is on, yay, this is a woman of color, therefore everything she does is great, even if she's a war criminal or, a capitalist, right? There are kind of bad ways of doing that, but just because other people do it in a bad way doesn't mean that we have to. And yeah, I think that's what I think.
That was wonderful. I think you make a lot of wonderful points. The one place where I think that your analysis could expand is in the United States. We've seen specifically, the more corrupted form that identity politics takes place in is that you will see identity being expressed by nonprofit organizations or NGOs is the form that that as you said, vulgar liberal identity politics takes. Therefore I think your statements about incorporating identity specific organization within class organizations is a much preferable alternative to creating some sort of identity nonprofit, which is supposedly achieving a class-based implication as an afterthought, which you will see a lot in the United States in the form of nonprofits like human rights campaign or disability rights groups in the United States, like Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is one of such. There's a couple of these different organizations. Do you have anything to say about the NGOs and the nonprofits as they exist in terms of identity politics in your experience or your local country?
Well, so there are nonprofits that have done, say, important work. Like in the UK, there's one of the biggest kind of LGBT nonprofits is called Stonewall, and they've done a lot of very important legal campaigning, which have resulted in policy changes that have changed people's lives, right? And yay, that's very significant, but they are, of course, very liberal and not, revolutionary communists, so not yay. But I think the emphasis is on, as radicals, we want to construct class-based organizations for obvious reasons, because we want to abolish capitalism. And, a lot of people, like the liberals say, will talk about classism, which is a thing, right? Like, say, a person from a very educated, well-off background acting as an elitist around poor people and assuming they're stupid. Okay, yeah, that's a really terrible thing that happens. But they'll focus on that rather than, say, the exploitation of the working class by the capitalist class, rather than the abolition of private property in favor of communal ownership. And so therefore kind of ignore the root causes of the classism and kind of prejudices that they do notice and rightfully complain about. So given that we should be constructing these class-based organizations, we want to make sure that those class-based organizations don't themselves reproduce oppressive social structures. Hence why it's important that they are from the ground up built to strive towards the abolition of all systems of oppression and enable the self-organization of different oppressed groups within this kind of umbrella organization, like historically happened in anarchist movements, where you have several different anarchist trade unions had women-only groups that were affiliated with them that did lots of important work. So in the CNT, you have Mujeres Libres, free women who did lots of important work during the Spanish Revolution. And I think that that's the kind of model that we need to do in order to ensure that you don't result in the kind of identity-based organization not in any way being related to wider class concerns and class struggle, and being like an NGO, which, while say doing important work, is part of the kind of wider reproduction of class society, even if they might make it in some ways slightly less terrible, which is not insignificant. But you also don't want the other kind of option, which is we just do class, we do other things tokenistically. You can't complain about sex in the organization because we have the women's group. It's like, I think you have to create a culture of striving to ensure that these systems of oppression kind of don't exist internally, and coming up with effective mechanisms for how to respond to instances where it is a problem, right? Like, I think when you are organizing, you have to already work out, say, what do we do if there's sexual violence in the movement? What do we do if someone complains about racism from a member of the group? I think it's really important to, from the ground up, have policies and procedures so it's not done on a kind of like ad hoc basis, because these are one of the things that, people say might talk about identity politics dividing the left. And I think the big thing that divides the left is oppression within social movements that result in, rather than us being all together in, say, big class-based organizations, the women, which historically will happen in many socialist groups, they leave due to sexism and form their own feminist groups that are then cut off from these kind of other social movements. And and that's what divides the left to a huge extent and continues to divide it. Loads of organizations have been massively internally damaged by issues to do with sexual violence. And this is obviously horrific, not just in terms of the victims of that violence, but also that there's loads of organizing that now isn't effective. And yet you also have the other thing where people defend, say, a rapist because, well, he's a good organizer. And so that's why I think identity politics is really important as a way to ground class politics rather than it being a kind of separate thing. hope that was clear.
No, I think it was very clear. Thank you so much for that commentary. I think that commentary shows that you've obviously been not only studying the theory of it, but you've been doing the organizing yourself. And here's where I want to kind of level with you on a certain
I haven't
level.
done much organizing myself. I just read a lot.
Okay, well, it sounds like you've encountered some of the problems that organizations that I've organized in are having, such as, there's organizations on the left that have issues with sexual violence and cover-ups within them that I've taken part in, and
so it's a huge thing in
that.
in the left in the UK as well.
Yes, yeah. So you've experienced all of that, but I want to take it to a little bit more of a personal place. I've been out as a trans woman for 3 or 4 years, and trying to participate in an organization like the IWW, there will be a difficulty in advocating for even being able to organize a separate, trans-oriented kind of group within these organizations, and it when you call for these things, it can be looked at as something that's disruptive to the class-based intent of the organization.
Sorry, because I wanted to just have a comment before you could, just take over and go into detail about your story. I had a question, not a question maybe for Zara, but my experience with even anarchist groups, I think there is an overall resurgent masculinity problem, not just within the left, but I think in communist and anarchist groups across the spectrum. And I think another thing, when it comes to organization, we aren't as rooted in communities. I think the point of struggle, or the basis of struggle, has shifted. And what we experience in Pakistan, there's already an existing struggle. Activists in many cases, co-opt, as you were talking about, co-opt movements and stuff like that. But there's also, there's also been, the debates around, how, say, the Black working class was, Black activists or people of color within these groups have been treated as well. And, it's just I think it's a very serious problem. And I think, Zara, if you could, sort of give your context, I think it'd be just a lot better.
Well, I think that we're both asking the same question here, which is, how do we deal with the emergence of a new, very identity denialist version of the left that we're seeing. How is there anything that we can learn from, say, Malatesta or Emma Goldman, these scholars that you know so much about, Zoe, about how to deal with having an oppressed identity and being in a leftist group and not being able to find a separate affinity group, to have autonomy for that specific sub experience that you have, without needing to be entirely separatist, right? Because this we call ourselves autonomous, because autonomy fuses the need for specific subclasses, substrata of the proletariat to be independent without having to be fully separate from the overall class struggle movement. So I guess the final question is, how does an oppressed person have autonomy in an identity blind class organization, according to your knowledge of anarchist theory, Zoe?
So what people had to do historically was just go for it, irrespective of what everyone else is telling them, right? So loads of historic anarchist women had to deal with loads of sexism within the movement, and a significant number of them responded to that by going, okay, well, we are going to organize to deal with this. And they would, say, form women-only groups and publish a newspaper which would critique sexism in the anarchist movement. They would actively try to change the internal structure and kind of culture of the organization that they were a part of, which obviously is a very difficult thing to do, but what other option is there, right? Like the only option is struggle if you want to achieve emancipation. And this is both within an oppressive, organization that's meant to be emancipatory and the wider society. And it's kind of, you have to not let other people's critiques kind of demotivate you or make you give up, because it matters so much that you kind of just have to keep pushing forward. So, Emma Goldman could have given up and stopped giving her lectures on homosexuality because loads of other people in the movement tried to kind of basically stop her from doing that or persuade her not to do it. She had to just not listen to what they thought and do it anyway because it mattered. And this can have significant impact on people's lives. So Emma Goldman, in her autobiography, Living My Life, talks about how a woman came up to her after one of her talks saying that, I've spent my entire life not knowing who I was. I have this kind of extremely depressing marriage with my husband, which is really soulless. And now I realized that essentially I'm a lesbian. And they hadn't realized that before that talk. And Emma's courage in giving the talk and not caring what other people thought transformed another human being's life. And even if that's just one person's life, that's unbelievably and inherently valuable. And so I think you kind of have to focus on the small victories and just keep going. So I received a lot of, how to put it, transphobic abuse online. I had lots of people attacking me when I was defending identity politics. And I responded just by keep making my arguments, keep trying to spread the ideas, because I think these things matter and I think they're necessary to achieve human emancipation. And that these other people are wrong. And they're obviously going to think I'm wrong, but I just have to keep going. And I understand that's kind of easier said than done, but who said it would be easy? These kinds of things are always hard. And many of the most important things in life are going to be very difficult, but they can have huge effects. So I think a key thing is learn about historic people from oppressed groups who were having to navigate emancipatory social movements that were reproducing oppression and be inspired by their struggles. So, like feminism in the New Left or anti-racism in the New Left, which often emerged partly to a great extent in response to oppression within these social movements, and try to, the fact that people in the past were able to do amazing things and they weren't special, they were just like you and me. Well, that means that you can also do amazing things and you can inspire the next generation. And it's, it's slow, steady work, but it has to be done. And hopefully over time, there can be cultural shifts within the left, because the reason why there are these problems in the left is because there are these problems in society, and people in the left are born into the society and reproduce these oppressive dynamics. And this is one of the reasons why I think kind of left organization should, say, have educational programs that are essentially compulsory, not just on class politics, not just, historical materialism 101 or like read Kropotkin, but also like modern, gender, race and sexuality politics. I really want to write a kind of modern intro to anarchism that incorporates the insights of contemporary feminism and kind of the Black radical tradition or indigenous political thought, so that there's a kind of modern anarchism that, unlike historic anarchism, is built up from the ground up to oppose all forms of domination, rather than just primarily focusing on the state and capitalism, which are of course very important, but human emancipation won't be achieved if you just abolish those two things. So yeah,
those are great lessons, and I don't think there is yet many outlets for transgender anarchism or transgender Marxism to give internal conversations about transphobia in the left yet. But I see that capacity building. So that's kind of exciting. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Sher. What did you have to say?
No, I was just thinking about this overall thing. I think like one of the things that has happened is, even if you look at a lot of the the bigger organizations like sort of DSA over here or other, they're very diverse organizations. They have multiple people in there, but I think like one of the shortcomings has been that it always gets, sort of co-opted by sort of people, a certain kind of male figure, right? Either like a student or something, someone like a professional or something, someone who's not rooted in communities or where actual struggles are taking place. And I think that's kind of changing, like you're seeing it change over here, especially the string of movements and sort of sort of actions that are taking place. But uh, it's a huge question, and then there's like other tensions, and such, and that's what I feel is compelling about the anarchist project today, because uh, they aren't afraid of violence necessarily, and I think that one thing is we're seeing a lot of people. They're smaller groups compared to before. Like people are like self-organized. They're various groups, but now those groups are like becoming bigger. But I think like it also has to do with your politics as well. I think like one thing is like in recent times there's been greater critique on the military industrial complex and like the prison industrial complex and the sort of knowledge production and all that. But I think like this idea of mutual aid not only brings the people together, but creating dual power in communities. And I think like in Pakistan, actually, like Amar has been very instrumental in that, demonstrating that there are people who if they put their energies in the right place, and people are there who are thinking about these questions. And I think that's one thing. But in terms of like the institutionalization and sort of, uh, I also feel like, that if our politics does not evolve and we don't develop new strategies and tactics, uh, and new theories and a new idea of communism or a new sort of idea of which is able to understand how power works, right? Uh, that that in my mind is the major question. I think how do we, historically the black proletariat, for example, within the US was subordinated to a lot of these struggles, and even when we're talking about like, the LGBTQ movement, like during the 70s, 80s was, uh, during the AIDS epidemic and sort of the self-organization which was taking place. And then you look at anarchist and like libertarian traditions in the US, I think, um, it's a little bit like you sort of you understand that I think the campus becomes like if your organization is built off of the traditional Marxist, like we're going to build a cater, and then like I was listening to some like video the other time, some like like intellectual of the DSA, he was saying we got to do what they're doing in India, which is build these student caters and then ship them out to the communities, right? And I think it just doesn't work that way anymore. I just don't see that happening, and a lot of people, I think a lot of people like are at the stage where they're just like, now we got to stand up. We just have to, like be involved somewhere and do something. And that's where like I totally agree with like Zoe and like the sort of points that you're bringing in. But the situation is, I think like the anti-trans wave and like especially LGBTQ wave in in this sort of fascist era is also really disturbing right now. And I think like whether it's anarchists, whether it's leftists, like we haven't done enough to sort of discuss what's happening on a everyday level.
On the shipping students out to organize the community, that's how Marxism began in Russia. You had educated student groups, which people like Lenin were part of, who would then have like underground training sessions with workers in order to try and like teach them Marxism. And the first time they tried this, first time Lenin's group tried this, the unintended consequence was that the workers they taught Marxism became like elitist and didn't want to hang out with the other workers anymore because they knew things now and were culturally sophisticated. And so when a strike was organized at this workplace, the kind of workers that had been taught like Marxism by these students, by these kind of very educated, privileged people, didn't even know the strike was happening. So the strategy kind of really backfired in this kind of first attempt.
But it also develops this uneven power relation, right? So,
exactly.
So what would happen was the students would be running the party, right, while workers would run the worker organization, and there was like an implicit hierarchy between the party and the worker organization as a front. So
which reproduces the class inequalities in capitalism itself.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And I think like there has to be a rethinking of this whole positioning. And I think it's not about like, for me, like the way I think about the identity politics problem, I think that especially it's been hugely I think like right now is a good example. Like the people mobilized right now, like you won't see a lot of so-called left organizations like talking about these movements, right, that are taking place right now, or other things. It's sort of a weird sort of left protectionism that's developing, and that worries me too. This sort of obsession with a new left protectionism, which is similar to like right protectionism in some ways.
And we've seen that specifically in the U.S. with the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, promoting the work of Adolph Reed, and both of them working to promote Bernie Sanders, at the expense of and also this podcast Chapo Trap House, which is kind of it's leftist but is kind of regressive on issues of identity. All these things becoming so big on the kind of left liberal scene, and the DSA doing all this promotion of these kind of views during this past summer when there was such an outburst of rage against racism. The left is remaining so irrelevant in choosing these people who are just regressive on these issues, where on these issues which are places where the workers are actually activated and acting, even if the formal leftist organizations are not always listening to that,
right? Yeah, but just another thing which I think we haven't discussed as well, but within these there's like an implicit like pro-modernist sort of pro-enlightenment sort of feel to it, right? Like rights are a certain way. A lot of people don't have rights to begin with, as seen in the trans community or with like illegal so-called illegal immigrants, right? Migrant workers or things of that nature. The notion of rights, it becomes reduced to this like public-private sort of debate, which I think which is also problematic, and also it's a question of control and power, right? How it goes also beyond rights, right? Which is like control and power, and I think how does and I get like I think like the question of these certain modern concepts, I think like, and the normativity is also sort of factoring into, so and I feel like Murray Bookchin, like in his 71 article, listen socialist or listen Marxist,
listen
right?
Marxist.
right? I think it was really, the way he wrote it was really kind of a fun read in the sense that, he's like saying, like you aren't looking at the conditions on the ground. You aren't trying to sort of develop sort of a strategy which can work in today's age. And I'm not saying that. I think like there are, for example, like, in the tenant strikes, there's so many actions now taking place. I think there's a lot of mutual aid action, direct action. There are other forms of, sort of actions that are taking place. But are is the goal to reproduce this thing when the situation is changing, so much, you know, in terms of strategy and, in terms of like the topology of power, I guess you could say.
So
You know,
I think there is a problem within the left, which you might call kind of left-wing conservatism, which essentially is they kind of relate to historic socialist literature the way that a lot of kind of religious fundamentalists do to religious texts, which is, so rule one is you don't actually read the text. You kind of just pretend to. But then rule two is that there's some kind of authority figure who will decode the text for you and tell you its true meaning. And then you attack other people for not subscribing to the correct interpretation as established by, say, the leader of the Central Committee. And that then what this results in is this kind of not only kind of really vulgar Marxism, where they're not even actually, grappling with Marx and like understanding him, but also where they're not doing what a good Marxist should do, which is you analyze the contemporary social situation, you develop an in-depth understanding of the processes by which it operates, and then work out a way in which you as a political group can intervene in order to push the class struggle forward, building on the already ongoing class struggle that's occurring in response to, these systems of oppression. And I think there's really much a need to, read the classics and like actually read them, not just kind of like pretend to, or kind of say you just, skim the Communist Manifesto and then interpret it through how your party's told you to understand it. I think there's a need to grapple with these historic texts, which I obviously spend a lot of time doing, but we have to go beyond and do what they did for their time, for our time. We have to be the, as it were, Malatestas or Rosa Luxemburgs or Karl Marxes of our age. And we have to continue the thing that they began, but not merely repeat them, and not kind of turn them into kind of sacred texts that establish what must be the case.
Yeah.
We instead think what is true, what is relevant, what is appropriate to our situation, and we work that out for ourselves. And it can be useful to read the classics to do that, but times have changed. Things which made sense then don't make sense now, and this is even the case historically, right? So, for example, Malatesta makes certain strategic recommendations in the 1890s about trade unionism in response to a massive general strike that occurs in the London docks. But by the 1920s, has massively changed his position on trade unions and how to organize within them based on his experience of the class struggle. So these historic figures were constantly updating their views. Lenin is the same in response to what is happening, what are we doing? And that's what we have to do. And I get very frustrated that a lot of left-wing people don't do that. And I think this is a cause for a lot of the left's problems. Why is it that, say, left-wing political organizations aren't at the forefront of the current class struggle? Well, there's lots of reasons, but I think one of them is that they're not actually developing modern theory to enable them to work out how to act in the contemporary situation. They're instead trying to impose outdated things onto the current situation, which then obviously aren't that effective. And something Malatesta says is he writes an article where he talks about there's been a massive peasant strike in Italy that's been very successful. And Malatesta says in response that, we might have all this like anarchist theory that these, say, peasants don't have, most of whom are illiterate at the time. but we must join them, we must struggle with them, and we must move forward with them, and that they have things to teach us rather than just us, spreading the gospel to them. And there's a sense in which a lot of kind of, in terms of how some certain social movements actually, or political parties actually relate to the ongoing class struggle, is we have the truth and we're just going to bring it to you, and then you'll agree with us, and then we'll, implement state and revolution, and everything will be fine. I think it's very much that if you look at the people who are actually doing the stuff and engaging the class struggle in the direct action and bringing social change, and participating in these protests, they're the people that the left needs to be listening to. And many of these people, of course, are themselves, view themselves as left wing, but a lot of them are just angry people responding to their oppression. And just like Malatesta advocated joining and working and moving forward with these peasants as equals in struggle, that's what I think the contemporary left has to do with ongoing kind of protests in America, where they're not kind of viewed as a means to expand the membership of the party, or a place to sell newspapers at the demonstrations, but instead that we ourselves have things to learn from the current struggle and to incorporate these things into our strategy, into ideas, in how we think about social change. And I think a lot of that isn't happening.
Not to cut you off, but this has been an amazing conversation, and I have loved our immense wisdom together, the three of us. I would love to have more of these conversations, but I think that I have to wrap up personally.
Okay.
But this has been a really good conversation for all of us, and I love your insights both on the state and how to move forward. You've given us so many. So thank you so much, Zoe. We want to talk to you more. Me. And this has been the seventh, I believe, episode of Facing Autonomy. Thank you so much, Sher. Thank you so much, everyone who's listening.
Yeah, thank you.